issue here. They follow the rules of the tefillah that's relevant, and not necessarily the rules of Kriya Shema. They have their own dinim and their own issues, and that's a topic of much discussion. Okay, so that's in terms of establishing that there is a mitzvah min Torah of Kriya Shema of some length. But even that sentence is still not yet finished. There's a mitzvah or there's two mitzvahs. So that's also a little bit of an open question. That seems to be a machlokes between the Rambam and the Ramban. We have an obligation to say Kriya Shema twice a day. So is that understood as one mitzvah, or is that understood as two mitzvahs? Is this one long cycle, or is it two mitzvahs? So that's a discussion. It's interesting. The author of the Shulchan Aruch, Joseph Caro, in his commentary to the Rambam, the Ketz Mishnah, so he raises an objection. He says, it's not fair. There's discrimination here. That Kriya Shema at night, as we'll see, Lahalacha L'Maisa, we say Kriya Shema at night all night. It's going to be a discussion in Mishnah what the time is. But it seems to be, in the end of the day, literally, that Kriya Shema is read all night. While Kriya Shema of the daytime is limited. As we know, we have Sosman Kriya Shema, like the announces every Shabbos, we have Sosman Kriya Shema in the morning. So why should that be? Why they should be parallel? It should be Kriya Shema all night and Kriya Shema all day. Now it happens to be, there's an opinion in the Mishnah, we'll see in a second, that Kriya Shema at night is only the first part of the night. So if we follow that opinion, so then they would be parallel. But we don't follow that opinion. So why are they not parallel? So the author of Shulchan Aruch, Kesef Mishnah, says, you know what? It must be that really Sof Zman Kriya Shema is D'Rabbanan. This whole topic that we're going to be discussing, that there's a time limit to when Kriya Shema can be said, that must be a rabbinical law. Because Minat Torah, it's not there. Minat Torah, they should be parallel, and you should say Kriya Shema all day and all night. So the commentaries on the side of the Shulchan Aruch, the Taz and the Magen Avram, they don't agree with this. They didn't accept the Shulchan Aruch tradition despite its pedigree. They didn't accept that. And they said, no, the reason it's not parallel is because linguistic issue. What does the Torah say? It said we should read Kriya Shema when b'shachbecha uvekumecha. Which we'll have to discuss. That's either a poetic way of saying night and day, or it's literal when you lie down and when you wake up, that it has some significance other than simply being night and day. But they're not exactly equal, as the commentaries point out. That b'shachbecha means when you lie down. So all night you are lying down. Uvekumecha is not really the opposite of that. Right? Omdecha, so standing is the opposite of that. Kumecha means when you get up. So just the Torah uses different language, that when you're lying down is all night, and when you're getting up is the beginning of the day, theoretically. It's not the whole day, probably. So therefore, Minat Torah, I think that's the way it works. And besides that, the Taz says, I have a proof that the Shulchan Aruch is wrong about this. Because the Gemara says later that women are not obligated in Kriya Shema. Women are highly encouraged to say Kriya Shema because of its clear importance in terms of the theme. But they're not obligated in Kriya Shema because there's different opinions in the Talmud Bavli and Talmud Yerushalmi, but we assume the issue is that it's a mitzvah saseh shazman grama. It's a time-bound mitzvah, so women are exempt from all time-bound mitzvahs. So says the Taz, if the Shulchan Aruch was right, so Kriya Shema is going 24/7. It's always there. So it's not zman grama. It's all day and all night. So as the later commentaries point out, you see what the issue is then. That if you have a mitzvah that's going for 24 hours, but it's in shifts, so it's a nighttime mitzvah then a daytime mitzvah, so is that called constant or is that a zman grama? So apparently the Shulchan Aruch thought that would be considered still a time-bound mitzvah. Women would still be exempt even though it's going all day and all night because it's kind of taking a shift. While the other opinions will say, no, if it's going all day and all night, then that's not time-bound, even if it's shifting from one mitzvah to the next. So that would also affect the question of remembering Yetzias Mitzrayim, because that has a similar cycle to it. So that was a little bit of a debate, but we tend to assume that Sof Zman Kriya Shema is a din daraisa, and also relevant to that question whether it's one mitzvah in Kriya Shema or two, for whatever effect it has, whatever difference it makes. We're clear so far? Everything making sense? Okay. So those are some background issues when we go into this topic. And the Mishnah begins with the nighttime experience, which, as the Gemara is going to explain, is something based on the psukim we read in the beginning of the Torah, that we have a tradition that Jewish days start at night, so Vayerev Vayiboker. So therefore, we start our day from the nighttime, and the Gemara is going to explain that. It's not an obvious point until you get to the Gemara. But the Gemara starts off telling us, when do you read Kriya Shema at night? So let's look at the Mishnah first, and we will discuss some of the themes that come out of it. Mei Masai Karin Es Hashma Ba'arvin. So from when? First we want to know the opening time. So from when do we read Shema at night? It's interesting, there was a comment of the Vilna Gaon on this. I said we're going to read the Mishnah first, but we'll stop for a second anyway. There's a comment of the Vilna Gaon on this word, the second word, Masai Karin. So he noted that if you learn Megillah, so Maseches Megillah starts off with a different kind of language. It says Megillah Nikres. Megillah is read. It's a singular language. And here it says, when do we read Kriya Shema? So you may not have noticed that, but he thought that was significant. He thought that there's a reason why it's plural here and why it's singular there. So he says, when it comes to Megillah, so we have the concept of Shomea Ka'ona, that we have one person in Shul reads the Megillah, and everyone else listens. So they all fulfill their obligation through listening to one person read the Megillah. So that's the way Megillah is done. So we use a singular language and Megillah is read. When it comes to Kriya Shema, says the Vilna Gaon, that doesn't work. There's no concept of Shomea Ka'ona by Kriya Shema. So you have to say it yourself. You can't have somebody else say it for you. So it's a big question whether or not that's true. Not everyone really accepted that idea. The Shagas Aryeh, who was a little older than the Vilna Gaon, has a discussion where he clearly assumes that it could work for Kriya Shema. He has a discussion of somebody who's mute, who's not able to talk, whether or not he could listen to somebody else recite Kriya Shema and fulfill the obligation that way. So it's a question whether that's true lahalacha, but it's the whole issue also. Where is the Vilna Gaon coming from? Why should that be? Why should there be such a limitation if it works for other things? So why should we say Kriya Shema is also a speech-related mitzvah? Presumably there should be Shomea Ka'ona like we have by other mitzvahs. So why not? So some suggest that this is too personal of a mitzvah, that this is your declaration of faith. It's not just a recitation. These are not just words that you can listen to somebody else's words, that it's almost like an action. The same way you can't have somebody else put on tefillin for you, you can't have somebody else take a lulav for you, because those are actions. You have to do them yourself. So too, Shema, it's words, but it has the effect of an action. You have to actually do it yourself. You can't have somebody else recite it on your behalf. That's how some want to explain. Karen Ora has a comment like that. That's how some want to explain. Again, whether this is even accepted, the halacha is a little bit of a question, but the theory is that maybe that's what it means. Okay, so from when do we read Shema at night? So here the Mishnah is a little confusing. It gives us a time when you start reading Shema, but it uses markers that we don't really relate to in order to try to peg down when the time is. So you start Misha Kohanim Nichnasim Le'achol B'Trumasan. You start from the time that the Kohanim go in to eat their truma, which is again a very complex marker. That here the Kohanim have their sanctified food, the truma that was given to them by us normal Israelim, and this food they have to eat in a state of purity. So if they were not in a state of purity, they'd have to go through a purification process, and they'd only be able to eat after that's over at the beginning of the next day. So that's perhaps a way of identifying the nighttime. So when they go in to eat their truma, so then that's the time when you say Kriya Shema. So the Gemara is going to discuss what exactly that means in the real world. In practice, we understand that means Tzeis HaKochavim, when it's fully dark outside. Now, by the way, the whole issue of what Tzeis HaKochavim means and what Shkia means, what the different terminologies for time means, it's a very complex issue. We'll talk about it a little bit to give us just some grounding in it. It comes up more on Daf Beis and Beis. Maybe when we get to there, we'll talk about it a little bit more. But roughly speaking, we know that night is a process. And so we have Shkia when the sun starts to set, and then there's twilight in the middle. And when the stars are out, when it's fully dark, that's Tzeis HaKochavim. So we assume that Kriya Shema has to wait until then before we can really start saying Kriya Shema. That's the opening time. And then the Mishnah doesn't say much more about it, but as we'll see in the Rishonim, it's a huge issue. So when does it end? That's the whole rest of the Mishnah. The rest of the Mishnah is when's the last time you can say Kriya Shema at night? So Ad Sof HaShmora Rishona, Divrei Rabbi Elazar. The opinion of Rabbi Elazar, it's the end of the first watch. So what's a watch? So a watch, the Gemara is going to discuss, it's either a third of the night or a quarter of the night. When we deal in halachic hours. So we assume a day is always 12 hours. Doesn't mean 12 times 60. It means that we divide however many minutes it is by 12. And so during the winter, an hour could be 45 minutes sometimes, and during the summer, an hour can be an hour and a quarter, could be, let's say, 75 minutes. It's a 12th of whatever zone you have. So we divide up hours that way, or we divide in fractions. So the Ashmor HaRishona, the Gemara is going to discuss, it's either a quarter or a third into the night. So Rabbi Elazar's opinion was that that's when Kriyat Shema goes until. It's limited by that. So we don't follow that view, but it happens to make more sense in terms of the question of the Shulchan Aruch, the Kesef Mishnah's question, because then it does parallel what we do in the morning. So just as in the morning we only have a small fraction of the day to recite Kriyat Shema, so too at night. But again, the reason we don't follow that is probably for grammatical reasons, because the Torah uses different language. B'shachlecha conveys all night when you are lying down, as opposed to b'kumecha when you are beginning to get up. So that was the view of Rabbi Elazar. And Chachamim omrim ad chatzos until halachic midnight. Rabbi Gamliel Omer, and Rabbi Gamliel is the third opinion. He says ad sheyala amud hashachar, until the morning starts. And then the Gemara goes on to tell a story which is going to flesh out a little bit what the debate between the last two opinions really is. It says Ma'aseh ba'abanav mibeis hamishta. Poor sons, they stay out one late at a party, and they find out they're memorialized forever in the opening Mishnah and Shas. It doesn't mention their names, right? You think you get in trouble when you come home late. So this is quite a record. So here the first Mishnah and Shas tells us that when the little sons came home late one night from partying, and they said, whoops, they said, we didn't say Kriya Shema. It says, Lo Karinu Es Shema. So Amalam, he says to them, don't worry. Well, after he probably rebuked them for staying out late, but then he said, don't worry about the Shema part. Because Imlo Allah Mun HaShachar Chayavin Atem Likros. Don't get the impression that your time is up. If the sun hasn't come up, if the morning star hasn't come up yet, so then you're still obligated to read. And you know what? It's not just me. Don't think I'm here rebelling against the establishment. It's not just my minority opinion. But Velozu Bilba Amru Ela Kol Ma Amru Chachamim Ad Chatzos Mitzvasan Ad Sheyala Amud Hashachar. That really, when Chachamim say something is two Chatzos, they really mean that it's actually all night. Which sounds a little bit like a contradiction. So Mishnah's going to explain how you understand that. But when they said it was midnight, it really meant all night. And then he adds in, it's a little bit of discussion how this flows. You see, it's a debate in the Rishonim. Hekter chalavim ve'varim, the burning of the fats and the limbs that were left over from the korbanos during the afternoon. So that also mitzvah sanat sheyala mashachar. The mitzvah goes all night, just like Kriya Shema really does in theory. V'kol ne'achal liyomecha mitzvah sanat sheyala mashachar, and whichever has to be eaten that day also continues up until Amud Hashachar. So if that's all true, so im came lama amru chachamim ad chatzos. So then, part of the rabbis say differently. So why did they say up until chatzos? So that he explains. So that's essentially a siyag. That's basically a gzeira. Kedei she laharchik adam min ha'avera. That we don't want people to get the attitude. The Gemara is going to flesh this out. A person's going to come home at night and he's going to say, I don't have to say Kriya Shema now. I'll sit on the couch. I'll kick off my shoes. I'll watch the football game a little bit. I'll have a drink. And then at 2 a.m. I'll say Kriya Shema. And then he's going to end up falling asleep on the couch, and he'll wake up and it'll be morning already. So in order to prevent that situation from happening, we say, no, you have to prioritize. So first, Shema before Chatzos, and then you do whatever else you have to do. So that's the way Rabbi Gamliel understands, that really in theory, they agree with him. There's no min haTorah reason why Shema should be up until Chatzos. And that was a safeguard that the rabbis put in so that we shouldn't come to forget about it. So it's not really clear halacha l'maisa whether there is such a safeguard or not, whether we actually paskin it like Chachamim, whether we paskin like Rabbi Gamliel. It's a little bit striking in general when we talk about gezeros, as we talked about a little bit in Shabbos afternoon for a few weeks recently. So usually gezeros are there for negative mitzvahs. You shouldn't come to Bimachal Shabbos, so we make a gezerah. It's unusual that you have a gezerah for a positive mitzvah. Some point out that it's actually perhaps explicitly the Gemara in Yevamos, which tells us that you should make gezeros. So the Gemara says, "Ushmartem es mishmarti, asu mishmeres l'mishmarti." You should make a safeguard for my mishmeres. So mishmeres usually is a reference to a prohibition. Hishamer is a language of don't. So it sounds like the Gemara is saying that you should make a safeguard for my prohibitions specifically. So a mitzvah saseh, getting a gezerah,